So I've titled today's sermon, Finding the Way in Uncertain Times. And to translate the word Tao, one of the ways that we can do so in English is actually to call it the way. But I'll explain a little more later. But for now, as we are all aware, we're gathering in a time when so many of us feel unsteady and the world feels loud and cruel, divided and painful. The language that we're hearing in so many platforms is sharp. Truth is being twisted or ignored completely. People are being gaslit. The pace is relentless. And there is, of course, a sense of fracture, as we know, between neighbors, within families, even within ourselves. And sometimes we're told that we must choose sides and hold fast to certainty, speak louder, act faster. And of course, many of us are tired. I don't know about you, but I know that myself and many of my contemporaries feel like this, spiritually tired. So we come today asking an ancient and deeply human question. And it's this: how do we live wisely in times like this? How do we stay rooted, compassionate, and calm when the world around us feels anything but? Today, I want to turn to an unlikely companion, the Tao Te Ching, written more than 2,500 years ago in a time, and this is interesting, how things don't change, written in a time of political chaos, violence, and social collapse. Interesting to note, and I will circle back to that in a moment. It is a text that, of course, then is born not in peace, but in upheaval. And yet it speaks with a calm, steady voice that feels astonishingly relevant. Before we dive into the text, what about the person who wrote it? Well, as you'll see, of course, the Tao Te Ching is always attributed to Lao Tzu. And the name by which he's known is not a personal name. It's actually an honorific title, meaning old man or old master. And the debate, I must be honest, does continue as to whether Lao Tzu is an individual or that even whether he even existed at all. But that's a whole other conversation. Perhaps some think that Lao Tzu is an amalgam of many different philosophers. I guess we'll never know with surety. But let's just, for the moment, imagine that it is the one old master. And this old master, Lao Tzu, was in the midst of an era known as the Warring States period. And that actually spanned before Christ, before what we know now is the Common Era, 481 to 221 approximately. And during this time, 7 states within China were fighting each other almost constantly for supremacy and control of the central government. And the Zhou dynasty, of course, the emperor, was in decline and could do nothing to maintain order because the separate states were all more powerful than the government, but evenly matched one against the other. So if Lao Tzu did exist, he's thought to have tried his best to instruct people in the way of the Tao, the creative and binding force which runs throughout the universe. But unfortunately, no one would listen. His explanation that people could live happier, more fulfilling lives by aligning themselves with the natural flow of the Tao, instead of placing themselves in opposition to it, went unheeded. And finally, he decided to leave all of that behind, and he made his way, allegedly on the back of a mule, through the mountains to disappear into some form of anonymity or seclusion after he had written the Tao Te Ching, which also allegedly he left in jars at the border, his parting gift to the country that he loved, but to the country which was in a state of collapse. So there's our context for this remarkable, remarkable text. And as I want to point out initially, the Tao is a way, it's not an answer. There are 81 now. Some people call them chapters. I have become accustomed to calling them verses. So if I interchange those words, that's the reason why. But 81 verses, 81 chapters, 9 by 9, which is a sacred number. It takes just a day to read, maybe not even that, maybe an afternoon. But of course, it takes a lifetime to learn. So the Tao Te Ching in verse 1 or chapter 1 opens with a warning. It says, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. You heard Wayne Dyer say that in his opening. And so from the very first line, we're told, beware of certainty. Beware of thinking that you've got it all figured out. And most importantly, to remember, for those of you who've never read it, Tony and I had a brief exchange this weekend, and Tony had said that she hasn't read it but would like to. And I hope that you, from today, Tony, and others, if you haven't, I really urge you to see if you can get your hands on a copy. And what you'll see is it's not a religious document. It is not a doctrine. It is not a set of beliefs. Rather, it is an explanation or an introduction or a revelation of a way of being, a way of moving through the world with humility, awareness, and trust. So for Unitarian Universalists like us, this does, of course, feel very familiar because we are people who draw wisdom from many sources. We are people who know that truth is not owned, but encountered again and again and again through a variety of ways, and through listening, through reflection, and through lived experience. So it's important to say at this point that the Tao does not tell us what to think. It just teaches us how to be. And that's what I would like to explore ever so briefly with you. Like I say, an afternoon to read, a lifetime to learn. So letting go, first of all, of false certainty. One of the great spiritual illnesses of our time is that illusion of certainty, and we're all vulnerable to it, myself included. Certainty that divides us into us and them. Certainty that can harden hearts. Certainty that demands simplicity in a complex, nuanced world. And the Tao Te Ching reminds us that reality is fluid, not fixed. Let me quote something from verse 2, chapter 2. When people see things as beautiful, ugliness is created. When people see things as good, evil is created. In other words, when we cling too tightly to labels and absolutes, we create the very divisions we fear. So the Tao invites us to practice a radical and, I would like to say, countercultural act. And that's a shout out to all the hippies amongst us. The countercultural act of not knowing. To pause before reacting. To listen before speaking. To hold space for complexity and that which we don't understand. In a culture that currently, especially, rewards outrage and, of course, speed, the Tao whispers, slow down, pay attention, stay open. And something else that runs like a golden thread throughout the Tao is, in Chinese, is Wu Wei. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of this, and for those of you who haven't, it's basically, it's hard to translate, but the power of non-forcing. Let me explain. At the heart of the Tao Te Ching is a concept which, as I said, Wu Wei translated is non-action, also non-action. But more accurately, it's understood as not forcing anything to be. The Tao in chapter 37 says this: the Tao never acts, yet nothing is left undone. How amazing. But I do want to say that this concept of Wu Wei is not a call to passivity. Rather, it's a call to right action. Action aligned with the deep currents of life, rather than action driven by fear or ego or rage or any of our baser natures. The Tao offers us through many of its verses the image of water. Here's another quote from chapter 78. Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water, yet nothing can better overcome the hard and the strong. Wow. We could probably spend a lifetime just meditating on that. I'll repeat. Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water, yet nothing can better overcome the hard and the strong. So water does not shout, water does not dominate, and yet, over time, of course, it has the power to reshape mountains. In the face of injustice, Wu Wei does not ask us to disengage. Rather, it asks us to act without becoming hardened. Remember that idea of soft and yielding. To resist without hatred. To work for change without losing our humanity. This, of course, may be one of the greatest challenges of our time right now. So another concept I want to touch very briefly on is this: leading and living from the inside out. Let me explain what I mean. First, the Tao Te Ching teaches that lasting change begins within. I'll quote, or rather paraphrase, chapter 54, verse 54. If you want to change the world, first bring your own life into order. Wow. We often ask, so how do we fix what is broken out there? Rather, the Tao says, or gently asks, who are you becoming as you try? Interesting question. And another verse, chapter 33, says this: knowing others is intelligence. Knowing yourself is true wisdom. And I know that the philosophers thereafter have quoted in different ways the same ethos. Knowing yourself is true wisdom. So from a Taoist perspective, justice without compassion becomes cruelty, as we know. Truth without humility becomes arrogance. And action without reflection becomes harm. So the Tao teaches us that the work of healing the world begins in how we listen, how we speak, how we treat the person in front of us, especially when we disagree with them. And finally, I'd like to just touch on the concept of walking the Tao, walking the way together. I'll quote from you chapter 64. It's about the way, the path. Of course, the Tao Te Ching does not promise that that way will be easy, of course, as we know. But here's a very familiar quote. I've seen it on fridge magnets and all sorts, but I just would like to take it from a slightly different perspective. This is from 64. A journey of 1,000 miles begins, and I like this translation, beneath one's feet. It's a slight different nuance there. Journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath one's feet. Normally we say with a single step. Why do I like that nuance so much? Well, I think it's because we do not have to see the whole path. In fact, we're not meant to. We only have to take the next faithful step. So therefore, the Tao, the way, is not a goal-oriented journey. Rather, it's a way of being. It's a way of living in the present moment, knowing that in a way, the way will take care of itself. We have to honor and be present to the moment. I also love another small verse from the same chapter, chapter 64. Get this. Whoever grips loses. And I remember that one of my great teachers in life always used to hold up his hand and say, Pippa, we have to hold everything with an open hand. And in a way, it's the Taoist principle, because to close restricts growth, and ultimately one loses what one holds on to so tenaciously. So the Taoist principle is one of what I would like to call not just open-heartedness, but also open-handedness. So in closing, let me just tie this up. The major themes, if you do get the chance to read, or could I even say reread, revisit, the major themes of the Tao Te Ching, are three. Simplicity. This text advocates for a life of simplicity, urging us to let go of unnecessary complexity and focus on what truly matters. The other major theme is humility. The Tao teaches that humility is a virtue that leads to wisdom and understanding. And it's not, of course, as we know, an understanding of the head. It's an understanding of our being, of our essence, promoting a sense of interconnectedness with all that is. And it's not to say, of course, that the cerebral understanding is not important, but ultimately the way is, as I said earlier, within. And finally, nature. Nature plays a central role in Taoist philosophy. It serves as a constant model to us in how to live in harmony with all that is, and also, of course, to recognize the cycles of life. Here we are in the midst of something truly, truly awful. But as we know, the circle is constantly turning. So, I guess my ultimate desire in sharing with you today is, in a way, a prayer for myself more than anything, but for all of us, that we may learn to move like water, strong without hardness, clear without cruelty, persistent without force. And may we trust that even now, that the way is in fact unfolding beneath our feet. May we trust it and may we walk it together.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.